welcome to Once Upon a Town, the show where we delve deep into Franklin history. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
Joe, what will we be talking about today?
Well, I thought we'd talk about the industry in Franklin, Mass., all the different mills and everything about manufacturing in Franklin, because there's a rich history in it. And it all began back in the early 1800s. It seems that a couple of women decided to do some reverse engineering. They got a hold of some straw hats and they took them apart to see how they were put together. And they discovered the secret of the plaited strands. And so they literally were the first reverse engineers, I guess if you could say it, but Mrs. Naomi Whipple and Miss Hannah Metcalf. So they're the ones that really that started it. Then the first straw manufactory in Franklin was begun in 1812 by Asa and Davis Thayer. Now, Asa died in 1916, so Davis Thayer, 1816, I should say. So Davis Thayer took over the business. And Davis Thayer had a homestead, and that was located on the corner of Union Street and West Central Street. And today that's the location of the Davis Thayer Elementary School, because school was built on his property. So that's why they named it the Davis Thayer School. But that's where the original homestead. And over the years, they kind of remanufactured the building a little bit. They added a third floor, like a mansard roof, and it became the Franklin Hotel. The post office was actually located there for a while until they moved downtown. And Benjamin Franklin Savings Bank actually started in that location too. And then, this is a map of one of the fire maps, the Sanborn fire maps. And this was taken from around the 1800s. And it shows a straw factory, which was located on Union Street between Central Street, West Central Street, and School Street. And that was the Erickson, Stewart, and Thayer's factory. And they developed straw factory. It was a straw factory. And here's a picture that was taken from the 1888 map. And it shows the factory. It was located, as I say, on Union Street. It was erected as a dye and bleach house, and it was first known as Thayer, Gay and Company. Then it became Davis Thayer Jr. and Brothers, and then it became Erickson and Stewart and Thayer. And it burnt down in 1902.
I think it's interesting to note that at the time this particular lithograph or this little sketch was made, to put into that particular map, that's already when the so-called Second Industrial Revolution had gotten underway, where it shifted from water power, which Franklin did have some of thanks to Minebrook and the Charles River, but less than other communities, to the sort of Second Industrial Revolution, when things shifted over to coal power, steam power, and so forth. And you can see that with pretty much all the mills in that famous 1888 map, that most of them are belching coal smoke into the sky.
That's right. Because a lot of mills were developed around the railroad. A lot of like the mill store, and a lot of those mills were developed down there, Unionville. But this one was not near a railroad, but yeah, you're right. Most of them were. And but they burnt down in 1902. Now in 1839, Colonel Joseph Ray brought his family to Franklin from Mendon, and they engaged in making cotton goods. Now when they came to Franklin, originally Colonel Ray purchased the Elm Dairy Farm down on Unionville, which is down off of West Central Street. And he eventually renamed it the Ray Dairy Farm. Today we know it by a different name, Gorelick Brothers. Israel and Maxwell Gorelick purchased it, and they renamed it Gorelick Brothers, which is still there to this day, although they've obviously modernized it and everything. And as I mentioned, Colonel Ray brought his family to Franklin. Colonel Ray and his wife Lydia Ray, they had 6 children total, but 3 of them died in infancy. But the 3 surviving brothers lived to full maturity. They were James Ray, Francis Ray, and Joseph Ray. Now this Joseph G. Ray was a son, so we call him Junior. He was the father of Lydia Ray Pierce and Annie Ray Thayer. And they were the ones that developed contributed money for the library, the Ray School, and a lot of other things. The Ray Science Building, Dean. But the 3 Ray brothers took up different lines of woolen goods, and they enlarged their mills, and they increased their numbers in different locations. Two of the sons developed what was known as the Ray Woolen Company in 1876, and this building shows that. Today, you probably recognize that as Franklin Landing. It's down near the railroad crossing on Union Street. And in 1899, it became the American Woolen Company, with Joseph G. Ray as the first vice president. Now, this is another Joseph G. Ray. He was the son of Edgar Ray, and Edgar Ray was the son of Francis Ray. So there was three Joseph G. Rays: Colonel Joseph Ray, his son Joseph Jr., and then his nephew Joseph G. Ray. And then here's a map that shows the Ray Woolen Company, and we can see to the left, you can see the Ray Woolen mills, but over to the right, you see a shoddy mill. That was the Ray Shoddy Mill, and that was built in the location where today's Franklin Agway is.
And it's very interesting. I'll draw everyone's attention to one thing. On the left-hand side of this particular picture is a street marked as Beet Sugar.
Yeah.
And it's still called Sugar Beet Street.
That's right.
It's a very short, just dead-end street, but there was a brief effort to make basically a refinery for beet sugar in the 1880s, which I believe a sample of still exists at the Franklin Historical Museum.
That's right. Yep, Sugar Beet Street. And eventually that fizzled out after about a year, and I believe they moved that industry south. And then that factory was used as a rubber factory. I think it was known as Appleton Rubber, I think. But yeah, it was down the end of Sugar Beet Street. Yeah. Although they call it Sugar Beet Road today, but I remember it as Sugar Beet Street, but whatever. Okay, and then where the Agway is, this is what that mill looked like. And they made shoddy mill. It was a shoddy mill. And
it probably merits mentioning what shoddy is. Today we use it as a term for poorly manufactured stuff.
That's right.
And in the 1800s, shoddy was actually recycled fibers, basically, much like what's done in India or Bangladesh today, where old clothes would be taken and then reprocessed into new cheap fabric for maybe sort of very cheap clothing. And I know that's how the Ray brothers sort of got their start in the 1830s or 1840s at least, was setting up shoddy mills. So I guess they may have had several shoddy mills, because I know that there was also one in the small gorge along Mine Brook that's currently by Encontro, which their workers would strip off tens of thousands of buttons and dump them in the stream.
Oh, wow.
And some perhaps less than scrupulous collectors have made a business of it recently, pulling that out of the stream.
Right. Wow. We're actually going to talk about that building where Encontro was. It's no longer there now. I guess they went out of business. But yeah. And we'll get to that eventually. This one is actually the same as the shoddy mill. That's the same one. That's on Cottage Street. And here's an interesting postcard. It shows the woolen mills, and it shows the Franklin Mill Store to the left. At one time, it was known as the Haywood Mills. Harry Haywood owned it. The thing that I love about this picture is you can see like a water trough next to the railroad tracks. Apparently, the steam locomotives had like a thing that would go down into the water trough as they were passing by, and they could collect water. So
it's also amazing how many train tracks there are in this particular picture. It's like 5 or 6 tracks across, whereas today it's basically 2 tracks.
That's right. The tracks that go off to Forge Hill, at one point there were 2 sets of tracks there. Now there's only 1 set, so there are lots of tracks there. Right. And here we are, Brookdale Mills. It was built by Ray and Draper as a cotton mill, so there you go. Later it was purchased by Worcester Textile Company for the manufacture of plain and fancy toweling. In later years, they did make the restaurant in Contro, and as I say, they're no longer there. I'm not sure. I think there was talk about maybe putting some sort of a distillery in there.
Yes, I think at the time of our recording, there's somebody that's applying for a license to have a distillery in there. We'll see if they succeed with that. Yeah. It would certainly be nice to see new business move into this historic property.
Right. They've since removed reduced the height of that tower. That was the way it was originally built, but now it's a shorter tower. Yeah. Now this particular company was down at the end of Dean Avenue, and in a few minutes I'll show you an updated picture of what the factory used to look like. But it was known as the E.P. Bassett Company, and it was built in 1886. And that company manufactured straw goods. And in 1926, it became the Thompson National Press.
And it's remained under that name, even though Thompson Press as a company is long gone,
Right.
Up until it was torn down in roughly August 2018.
A couple of years.
The process of stripping the siding off began in June, and then the building was
Right.
gone by the end of the summer.
Right. And the Thompson Press developed heavy printing presses, paper cutters, and creasers. Yep. And then here's from the Sanborn Fire map, when it was still the Bassett Company. And you can see the railroad tracks right next to it. And you can see the basic shape of the building. Now, here's a picture from the 40s that shows the Thompson Press. And if you look carefully, you can see the roof line of the original building. And to the right, you can see the addition. And you can see how the roof line is horizontal. And you can kind of guess how that building was added onto. And then they added on to the left side as well.
I think it's really, really kind of interesting. I had a chance to speak with Bernie Veluti, who's a World War II veteran from Franklin. He survived the sinking of his destroyer at D-Day, now almost 75 years ago. And he talks about attending Franklin High School in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and they obviously had much more of a trades focus at that point in time, and he studied to be a machinist essentially. And their trade program had students go from the high school, which was in what's today the Davis Thayer School, at the corner of Union Street and West Central Street, and they would go over, some of them, including him, to the Thompson Press building and learn sort of the machining trade right there.
Wow. It's interesting you mentioned the Davis Thayer School and a trade school, because in the 40s there was a proposal to build a trade school right there on Union Street where that factory used to be, the Thayer factory. And what they would have done is they would have connected the two buildings. They had the Ray School, which is on School Street, and you had the Davis Thayer School. They were proposing to build a technical school right there on that plot and connect the two buildings so that there was like one huge building. And they would have even added a couple of classrooms onto the Ray School, because that was only a four classroom building. But the proposal never really went anywhere. It did get past the drawing board. But it was interesting that you mentioned that. And the other thing that I would mention, you talk about young men working, developing a trade. My father went up to a place up in Quoddy, Maine. They had some sort of a lot of barracks and things up there, and an encampment. And they were using them, they were bringing young men up there to learn trades. Like my father learned how to be a machinist, and where do you think he got a job when he come back? The Thompson Press. So it's interesting that we talk about that. Yeah. Now down in City Mills, there was a felting mills, and this was taken around 1900. It was known as City Mills Felting Mills.
And actually, I'll just refer to City Mills for a second. City Mills is actually currently in Norfolk, which was split off from a part of Franklin and along with part of Wrentham around 1869.
That's right.
To be one of the newer towns in Massachusetts.
Yep.
And it's interesting because in the colonial period and sort of the early American Republic period, City Mills was virtually the downtown. There was activity in downtown Franklin, but this is sort of one of the kernels of industry for Franklin, and ultimately the town lost it to the new town of Norfolk.
That's right. Yep. And then from the Sanborn Fire map, we see City Mills Company's felting mills, and eventually it became part of the American Felt Company. So in 1909, Harry Haywood developed the Franklin Felt Company. It was down where Franklin Felt is located today, down on Haywood Street. And Haywood Street is obviously named for Harry Haywood. It was later sold to American Felt, and American Felt also had a factory over on Alpine Place. And it was located kind of at the intersection of Alpine Row and Alpine Place, down near the railroad tracks. That burned down in it burned down in later years. And then that's where the American Felt built their factory there. Today, getting back to this particular factory that we see in the picture, today it's known as Mosley Mills, down on Haywood Street. They've actually developed the old factory building into different businesses and things. So, and then here's where Enoch Waite's felting mill. It was located on Alpine Place. As I say, that burnt down in in the 1890s, and then it was replaced by American felt. And there's another view of it when it was Waite's felting mill. And then here it is as American felt. Now, Harry Haywood had a factory right along the railroad tracks down at the crossing, Nason's Crossing on Union Street, and it was known as Haywood's Company. And in later years, it became the Franklin Mill Store. It was actually auctioned off in 1939, I believe it was, and Harry Bullocken and another gentleman bought it. But it was Harry Haywood bought this property in 1891, and he added the north wing and the storehouse to it. So, and then this is when he still owned it. It was known as the Haywood Satinette Mill. Satinette, I think, is the material you put inside hats and everything. It was like a very fine type of a material. Yeah. Okay. And then he continued the line up until 1895 when the north wing was added. So now the location of this will probably surprise a few people. It was known as the Bassett Woodbury Company, and they manufactured straw goods. And it was located at the corner of Main and School Street. And so you're probably thinking, well, wow, this is where Ginley Funeral Home was located today. That's right, because this burnt down in 1889, and a gentleman by the name of George F.S. Singleton would build his residence on that site. And again, today that's the Ginley Funeral Home.
Pretty hard to imagine a huge factory at that spot.
I know it, but it was big. In fact, here's the Sanborn fire map that shows how big it was. Yep. And I was able to get this photograph from Dr. Rob Lawson, a history professor at Dean, and I was really grateful because it showed a picture of that Bassett, the factory, right there.
And for reference, this is, I think it was the Grace Universalist Church.
Right.
This is where the Dean College Library is today.
That's correct.
And I forget when it burned down. I think it was another fire casualty, like so many of the grand buildings of Franklin.
Well, that's what I really love about this picture, because this is a picture of that actual church that burnt down in 1886. In 1886, there was a huge fire in Franklin, probably the most destructive fire that Franklin has ever seen in terms of the property damage. Nobody died, thankfully, but this church burnt down. Across the street from it was where the library is today. There was a hotel called the Central House. That burned down. Next to it was Daniels Hall. That burned down. And the fire even started in a small building behind that. And it must have been just a lot of embers and everything that just contributed to all these buildings being burned down. But yeah, so this was replaced by the Grace Church that we remember. Well, we remember, not you. And that was torn down in the 60s to make way for the library. Now down by the railroad tracks, just past where the Haywood Mills was this building. It was called the Franklin Knitting Company, and it was formed in 1882. And in the early 1900s, it became known as Franklin Yarn. But it burnt down in 1906 and was replaced with a big cement-proof building. And we'll see a picture of that in a minute. Right now, this is the Sanborn fire map that shows it. It's interesting, they call it Franklin Netting Company. It was really Franklin Knitting Company. I can only imagine the guy that drew this map, somebody must have said to him, the name of that place is the Franklin Knitting Map. What did you say? Franklin Netting? Oh, okay. Something, I don't know.
Lost in translation.
Something got lost, but anyway, it's Franklin Knitting Mills. But then, in 1907, when they replaced the wooden structure with the cement building, and this is a picture of that. And I believe Franklin Paint was located there, I think, and probably still is.
And I think it is still today. As far as I know, it's still in business.
Okay.
For a long time, they were just about the only customer using that railroad siding, the last of the train lines that didn't continue to Forge Park.
Right.
And they would have certainly when I was growing up, a rail car there with some kind of chemicals for mixing the paint. I haven't seen it there in a long time. I hope that doesn't bode poorly for their business. But
oh wow. Okay. And then this is the Saxon Worsted Company. This is located down at the foot of today's Worsted Street. So I think it's interesting to note that you have Saxon Street and you have Worsted Street. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that the naming of those streets was after this factory. because they were close by to that. This was built on the site of the former Clover worsted mills, which had been built in 1857. But then this was built. And then in 1883, it became Whiting's Box Mill. And after that, it became Saxon Worsted. But in 1891, that firm left for Rhode Island, at which time it became Singleton Worsted. And then here is a picture from another Sanborn fire map showing Saxon Worsted in its location there. And then in 1911, in fact, I've just recently been going through the Franklin Sentinels for 1911, and it talks about Clark Cutler, so it's perfect that we talk about this one. In 1911, three gentlemen, Walter Clark, William Cutler, and Thomas McDermott got together and they formed Clark Cutler McDermott. Originally, it was they specialized in horse blankets, so that was their specialty when they built this.
And it's a fascinating company. I have heard a little bit about their history through the years. It's definitely one of those companies that a great number of Franklinites of a certain generation all seem to have worked for at some point.
Present company included.
And there you go. And it's such a fascinating, fascinating story because Clark Cutler McDermott, they started off doing something that was about to be obsolete, horse blankets right as cars were coming around, and yet were very clever at adapting themselves to automotive and stayed in business until 2016 when they actually ultimately went out of business.
That's right.
But at that point in time, they were supplying the interior padding for cars for General Motors, Lada in Russia, and Volkswagen.
That's
so
right.
major car manufacturers, and all out of the same 1911 factory. In fact, even with many of the same pieces of equipment that they had in 1911 for making non-woven fibers and so forth. So
right.
Very interesting story. I'm curious to hear your tales of working there.
Unbelievable. They first of all, the mats that went under the cars, under the carpeting in the cars, I worked on a machine that we called it the cutter, and it would cut into the exact shape, and we'd pile them up and put them on pallets and send them off. But the other thing that they specialized in was it was a product called Airlock. And Airlock were anti-vibration pads. And what they would do is they would put these under heavy machinery, and it would prevent the machines from vibrating and bouncing around and everything. So that was one product that I worked on. But they did all sorts of things, products like that. And as you say, they've now since gone out of business.
Airlock, though, curiously, is still in business as a separate company in the center of that large complex. So most of the surrounding wings of the building are empty at this point, or just have old machinery sitting in them at the time of this recording. But the central building is actually still in use by Airlock, which was spun off somewhere along the way as a separate company.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so they're still up and running, even though Clark Cutler McDermott is no more.
Wow, because I see Airlock, a sign out there, and I'm thinking, wow. But I didn't know that. That's good to know, because that's what I was working at before I left there. So, cool. Now down on Winter Street, we have the E.A. Staples Straw Factory, and it's just up the street from the Theron Metcalf School. Of course, today it's housing for the elderly.
And actually, this building, it does still stand over there. It's sort of tucked away near that Winter Street Franklin Housing Authority building for the elderly. And to my understanding, and I could be incorrect about this, but yeah, I think it's currently used mostly for storage for all kinds of old plumbing fixtures that the Ranieri family, today pretty much the largest landowners in Franklin, that they, I believe, have gathered from various construction projects because they also have a separate business with one of the family members in plumbing. So they sort of gathered all kinds of old radiators and things like that and stored them in there for anyone that's looking to do an antique style rebuild of a property. So some interesting treasures surely stocked away in there.
Absolutely. I was there recently in that area to take pictures of what the building looks like today as part of my Then and Now project. And it looks like there's activity there, but it's not really an active building, I don't think. So I think you're right, yeah. Now, in that triangle of downtown Franklin that makes up part of Main Street and West Central Street, where the black box is, and behind there was the Metcalf the Metcalf lumber yard, and eventually they became Franklin Lumber. But this is the Otis Metcalf and Sons sawmill, and it was located in that triangle. And they also had a box factory back there too. So, and then you can see how there's the map showing Central Street, West Central Street today. It used to be Central Street, but now it's West Central. And you can see the O.F. Metcalf and Sons grist mill. So they had all kinds of manufacturing back there. And here's we talked about the sugar beet company. This is a map from 1888, and it shows the sugar beet company up back 1879. Oh, this is the 1879 map. I'm sorry, and it shows the sugar beet the company up there. And after a year, the company closed, and they went south, as I mentioned before. And again, in 1899 became Appleton and Sons, a manufacturer of rubber heels and soles and insulating compounds.
And I want to draw everyone's attention to the railroad line that goes past all these places. That the addition of the railroad in the 1840s was a very, very big event for Franklin. It's important not to overlook. It was actually funded initially. The first railroad startup here in Franklin was the Milford, Franklin, and Providence Railroad.
That's right.
Which I believe did it ultimately become a part of the New York and New Haven, the really large railroad system of the 20th century.
Right.
But that was actually funded, I think, originally by the Ray brothers as sort of they were sort of venture capitalists almost for Franklin.
Absolutely.
And of particular note for Franklin history, the railroad prompted the arrival of a large number of Irish immigrants who became the first Catholics in town, launched St. Mary's, and their handiwork is still on display, the work of these so-called Irish navvies over on the western edge of town along the southern New England trunk line trail that heads all the way into Connecticut, which is this former rail line.
That's right.
And you can see all these, big pieces of stone they laid in place as walls there in the 1840s that are still in place all these years later.
Oh, yeah, because I've seen those walls. My wife and I go down there and walk, and I wondered about that. Wow, interesting. Huh. Because to me, digging out, you walk especially down, before you get to Spring Street, you can see where they had to dig through a big hill. And back in those years, I mean, what kind of equipment did they really have? And that was a lot of land to move to make way for that train to go through there. It's like, wow. So they had a lot of people work on that. Wow. So then the Franklin Beet Sugar Refinery, that was from the 1884 map, I believe. It was the 1884 map. We had a Franklin soap manufacturing company down at the end of Dean Avenue. It was right near the Bassett Company, which became Thompson Press. Today there's a house in that location. Harry Bullock actually owned that property, and he built that house there. And there's from the 1888 map, and we can see I circled the soap company.
And in the foreground, I'll draw everyone's attention to the New York and New England Railroad, which replaced that Milford, Franklin, and Providence small little railroad.
Exactly.
And they actually, right across the way from the former Thompson Press building, they had a turntable too for turning locomotives around.
That's right.
And servicing them in that big sort of warehouse there.
That's right. It's down at the end of Alpine Place. You reach the end of Alpine Place where you turn right onto Milliken Avenue, but if you go down, there's like a dirt road down in there, and that's where that roundhouse was. Yeah. Very interesting. We had a piano factory in Franklin. And this was that big, large building where if you were standing at the train station and looking across the tracks up on top of the hill, there was this big red building, and that was where the piano factory was. In later years, Freddie Saltman used that as a storage for his Franklin Furniture Company. And then from one of the maps, we see the passenger station and the Trowbridge Piano Company up on top of the hill. And you can also see Union Electric had a company right behind there. And yeah. The end.
Joe, this has been a great description of the industries of Franklin. I think it's also worth noting that even today, we actually still have quite a bit of industry in Franklin, though much of it's over in Forge Park or the South Franklin Industrial Park and places like that. Actually, we have a large number of people that commute in, mostly from Rhode Island and central Massachusetts, to work in factories that today make scalpels and scientific instruments, even some that make chemicals, electronics. One of the most unusual is certainly Kinetic, a large British defense company that makes basically body armor, bomb disposal robots, and interior armor for armored vehicles that would go out into places like Iraq or Afghanistan to prevent metal shattering off the inside of vehicles if they're hit by a bomb or something like that.
And once again, I worked in that company too.
No kidding.
for a while, I worked as a contract employee for a little bit with them. Yeah.
Jeez, you've really had the roundup of experiences when it comes to Franklin industry.
Well, you mentioned the train being responsible for bringing a lot of industry to Franklin. 495 was responsible for bringing a lot of industry to Franklin as well.
And we've sort of seen that shift since the 1960s when 495 went in with the growth of all these new industrial parks, that suddenly other parts of town that maybe had been remote from the train tracks of the past suddenly became very easy to get to in the age of highway travel.
Well, that's it. The automobile was really responsible for people being more mobile than they were back when the train was the only means of transportation.
And it's fascinating when you think about some of these industries that have evolved over the years. The one that I always think is particularly interesting is not only the case of Clark Cutler McDermott, but Garlick Farms, which, along with Clark Cutler, was a big employer in town for so many years. It still is, although many of the people that work there are from other towns today and commute in.
And I didn't work there, though.
Yeah. They missed out, Joe. But Garlick Farms, they're very interesting because today they don't source their milk locally like they used to. Today, if you watch on 495, there's big semi-trailers, big tankers bringing in milk from near the Canadian border in northern Vermont, all to be pasteurized here and then sold in the Boston area. Now that we've lost a lot of the farming that used to be characteristic of this region, but we still have that industry today.
It used to be the other way around. We'd bring our milk to Boston. Now Boston's bringing their milk to us. Go figure.
Well, Joe, great description. And we'll close there on this particular episode and move on to the next.
All right.
Thank you for watching. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors. Good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.